A child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. That proverb captures something about human development that psychologists like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth spent entire careers studying. Their research on attachment showed that the way children are treated by the people and institutions around them literally shapes the architecture of their minds. When children are embraced by their community, they grow up expecting the world to meet them with care. When they are ignored, dismissed, or pushed aside, they adapt in other ways. They become vigilant, sensitive to injustice, quick to notice when systems fail. That line about burning down the village hits close to home for me. My childhood wasn't a fairy tale of resilience. It was complicated. I struggled with severe depression from a very young age. Mental illness has a way of sharpening certain instincts. It makes you sensitive to suffering, hyper-aware of hypocrisy, and sometimes a little unhinged. For the past 11 months, I've felt an increasing urge to burn the CMSD village to the ground. Though the more accurate description isn't arson. It's closer to a prescribed burn, the kind used in forestry to clear out rot so healthier growth can take root. Systems accumulate decay when problems are ignored for too long. Sometimes the only way forward is to clear the dead brush. Depression, trauma, and years spent navigating broken institutions don't usually produce a calm, tidy form of advocacy. People shaped by those experiences rarely present themselves in the polite, well-regulated way institutions prefer. Advocacy fueled by lived experience tends to be messy, emotional, relentless. And that mindset is exactly what shaped how I approached my children's education. My experience and my kids' experience at Newton Baker showed me what a school community can look like when it genuinely embraces families instead of merely tolerating them. The educators there treated me with dignity and respect. Not only when things were easy, not only when conversations were comfortable. They did it consistently. Even when I was advocating like the crazy parent. Even when I was frustrated and probably annoying as hell, if I'm being honest. Even when I was struggling deeply with anxiety and depression at the same time. From my perspective, they handled communication with a calm professionalism that made it almost impossible to stay angry with them. Their integrity kept cutting through whatever frustration I brought into the room. Humans sometimes want to stay mad. We cling to anger like a security blanket. But how do you stay angry at an administrator who greets tardy children by asking, "Did you eat this morning? Was it enough? Do you want to stop by the cafeteria and get more before class?" When you see that kind of care with your own eyes, real care, not the performative kind, it changes the entire relationship between a school and its community. The educators at Newton never treated me like a problem to manage. They treated me like a human being who deserved to be spoken to with respect, because I was the parent of children they genuinely cared about. They understood my background. They understood that the intensity one sometimes brought into those conversations wasn't random hostility. It was the voice of a parent trying to make sure her kids were safe and supported. They didn't know all the details of my life, but they understood enough to recognize that I was still growing into the person I want and need to be for my children. I was a special education student from first grade all the way through graduation. Teachers played an enormous role in helping me build a future. Many of the lessons that other children learn from stable family environments, I learned from educators. That isn't a criticism of my family. My family loved me endlessly, but they were battling demons of their own when I was young. Serious struggles that tore our family apart for years. Love was always present, but stability wasn't. So my teachers became anchors. Later, my professors did too. They helped shape the person I eventually became. They helped me build a life worth living, worth loving, worth celebrating. Because I had seen what a healthy school community looked like, what happened next was impossible to ignore. After Newton, my children attended Riverside. The contrast was immediate and painful. The culture was different. The responsiveness was different. The level of care was different. Serious concerns were raised about the treatment of students and the broader culture of the school. Those concerns were never meaningfully addressed. At one point, a student brought a loaded gun into the building, and it did not appear to trigger any meaningful reflection about the toxic school climate. Eventually, the problems reached a point where I was no longer comfortable sending my children to school. When I made the decision to pull them out, I explained why to their teachers. Not one of them responded. Since then, my children have been absent for more than 90 consecutive hours. No one from the school has called. No one has attempted to address the concerns that led to this situation. Emails to the special ed teachers, principal and administrators go unanswered. For an institution whose mission is supposedly centered on children, that silence speaks volumes. And it reinforces my belief that removing them was the right decision. About a week after I stopped sending my kids to school, Cleveland was confronted with the horrifying deaths of Mila and Amor. What their mother did was evil. There is no softer word for it. But tragedies like that do not appear out of thin air. Catastrophes like that grow in the dark for a long time before the public ever hears about them. They emerge from complicated intersections of severe mental illness, institutional failure, and systems that stop listening to struggling families long before things reach a breaking point. Long before the headlines, there are warning signs. There are people in distress. There are opportunities for intervention that quietly pass by, which is part of what has left me so unsettled about my own situation. My severe mental health struggles are not a secret to the school or the district. My children have now been truant for an extended period of time. And all of this unfolded at the exact moment our community was confronting one of the most horrifying tragedies imaginable involving children and a severely mentally ill parent. Yet despite all of that, there has been silence. No outreach. No attempt to check on my children's safety. No effort to address the concerns that led to this situation in the first place. When a system whose entire mission is supposedly centered on children shows that level of silence in circumstances like these, it raises disturbing questions about whether warning signs are being taken seriously at all. But what I have experienced with Riverside feels like more than simple indifference. Indifference would at least imply neglect. What I have seen instead looks like something closer to institutional avoidance, an unwillingness to engage with concerns, even when doing so is required by law, by professional ethics, and by the basic duties outlined in educators' own job descriptions and contracts. My children never felt welcomed at Riverside, and the reality is that many students do not feel welcome there. The environment they described, and that many families have quietly described to one another, feels less like a supportive learning community and more like a punitive one. In environments like that, discipline can begin to drift outside the boundaries of what professional ethics and education law actually allow. When schools rely on harsh responses instead of engagement, students stop feeling safe. Forcing kids to chant that they are safe as a punishment is absurd and will only contribute to them feeling unsafe. You cannot brainwash kids to feel safe. Parents stop feeling heard when communication becomes brief, vague, or disappears entirely. That has been my experience with Riverside. Since direct communication has gone nowhere, perhaps social media will be the only place left to raise concerns. After all, administrators seem far more visible online cultivating personal brands than they are responding to families who are asking legitimate questions about their children's education. When leaders are focused on building online reputations and partnerships with billion-dollar businesses, while parents cannot even get a response to serious concerns, it sends a troubling message about priorities. At this point, I have little reason to believe that concerns raised publicly will receive any more attention than the ones raised privately. When institutions create no real incentive or accountability for responding to families, silence becomes the default. The entire culture of the institution has shifted away from supporting children and toward managing them, like they are inmates. That kind of environment does not just harm individual students. Over time, it teaches families that raising concerns will lead nowhere. And when institutions create that kind of culture, the warning signs that should trigger intervention are far more likely to be ignored until something far worse happens. The issues surrounding the closure of Newton also revealed something deeply troubling about how decisions are being made within the district. Like every other parent with a child on an IEP at Newton, we never received a proper IEP team meeting to determine what placement would best serve our child on an IEP after the closure. Under federal law, decisions about a student's placement are supposed to be made by an IEP team, people who actually know the child and understand their needs. Instead, families were pressured to choose new schools quickly, often without the opportunity to visit them or fully evaluate whether those placements were appropriate. I trusted the educators at Newton. If the process had allowed it, I would have taken their input seriously when deciding where my children should go. Instead, that careful process was replaced with pressure and urgency. The more I began looking into the legal framework surrounding these decisions, the more questions I had. When you suspect something in a system might be illegal, you don't simply walk into a police station and say, "I think something wrong is happening." First, you have to identify which law might apply. Then you have to determine which agency has jurisdiction. Then you have to gather evidence and present it in a factual, unemotional way. Did I mention I have mental health challenges? Because investigators do not care about anger. They care about statutes, documentation, and evidence. Sometimes you file a complaint, and the agency says they don't have jurisdiction. Sometimes they refer you somewhere else. Sometimes the process takes months or years. It is exhausting work. And yet I continue doing it. Because once you see systemic problems clearly, you cannot unsee them. This issue is larger than my family. During a board meeting last year, I learned that 3 special education teachers in CMSD have taken their own lives in recent years. Hearing that made me sick. Special education teachers are often the quiet architects of other people's futures. They are the people who looked at a struggling kid like me and decided I was still worth investing in. The fact that educators doing that work feel so unsupported that they reach that point should alarm every person in this community. Which brings me to something that has become a strange distraction from the real issues. Supporters of Sherry Abrensky have been circulating conspiracy theories suggesting that my advocacy is somehow coordinated with candidates in the Cleveland Teachers Union election, particularly Errol Savage. That is completely false. And the current situation is hysterically ironic. My communication with Sherry was never private. The email I sent was copied to multiple members of CTU leadership, and when she responded, she replied to that same group. She even openly mocked me for emailing the wrong people despite me simply getting it from their website. I would be curious to know if anyone on that email thread is perpetuating fabricated rumors, especially if they are in this election. Because the people CC'd in the email are fully aware of the tone and substance of that exchange. I was shocked by the unprofessionalism and no one addressing it. It seems the CTU culture is one that currently openly tolerates leadership being toxic to the community. Working in Cleveland as an educator requires those educators to be respectful to parents, particularly when they are in leadership and using their leadership to support decisions that result in harm of families. If you are going to support harm, if you are going to support decisions that derail people's lives, then you need to be able to respectfully reply to families in crisis. That is a responsibility of the job. Here's the irony. In that response, my concerns were dismissed as conspiracy theories. I was also told that I was not doing enough to support my children through the closure process. That response said a lot to me. What struck me most was the absence of empathy. It was more like insults and gaslighting, barely pretending to actually care about the students. When institutions make decisions that deeply affect families, the least we should expect from leadership is the willingness to listen to the people living with those consequences. The claim that Errol Savage, Chris Malinowski, or anyone connected to CTU is coordinating with me is completely fabricated. They invented a narrative that does not exist in reality. Speculation is not evidence. Assumptions are not facts. What actually happened is far more obvious. Some people saw my video and decided to weaponize it. By pretending that my advocacy is connected to a candidate, they create a convenient excuse to tell others not to vote for that person. That is not political analysis. It is scapegoating. Instead of asking questions, they invented a narrative and tried to pin it on someone else's campaign. By attaching candidates to actions they had no role in, they are actively undermining those candidates and damaging the integrity of the election itself. My advocacy is not directed by any candidate. It is not coordinated with any campaign. It is not part of any political strategy. It is simply the work of a parent speaking about her experiences with Cleveland's education system. Ironically, the people spreading those rumors are the ones risking harm to the election by falsely attaching candidates to actions they had nothing to do with. My advocacy belongs to me alone. Sometimes it looks passionate. Sometimes it looks relentless. And sometimes it probably looks a little unhinged. But it is rooted in a lifetime of watching educators change the trajectory of children's lives, including my own. The teachers who supported me when I was a depressed special education kid helped build the stability that my family now stands on. The educators at Newton Baker treated my children and our family with a level of dignity that we still miss every day. So when I watch systems fail children and families now, my silence is not an option. I refuse to give up on the kids growing up alongside my own. And I refuse to give up on the remarkable educators in Cleveland who deserve to work in institutions that are just as committed to children as they are. If the alternative is staying quiet while children are pushed through broken systems that ignore their rights and dismiss their families, Then I am perfectly comfortable being the unhinged parent in the room. And one final thought, to any licensed educators spreading misinformation about my content that has the potential to harm the CTU election or teachers' reputations, or has the potential to harm my mental health. Speaking as a former child of bureaucracy, I know exactly what form I need to fill out to address your actions.